Glenn Hughes remembers the first time he walked into Deep Purple's world. Ritchie Blackmore was already a legend. His guitar tone, his presence, his reputation. For a young musician like Glenn, joining the band was both thrilling and terrifying. Ritchie had a reputation for being unpredictable, intense, and fiercely protective of his art. The other members welcomed Glenn, but he knew instantly that Ritchie's attention was like a laser, either warming or burning. In rehearsals, Glenn noticed Ritchie's perfectionism. Every note, every pause, every chord had to fit into the vision Ritchie had for the band. Glenn admits it was intimidating at first. He tried to match the intensity to earn respect not just as a singer and bassist, but as a musician who could survive Ritchie's scrutiny. Despite the tension, there were moments that hinted at a deeper complexity in Ritchie. Glenn remembers seeing him laugh quietly in corners, tuning his guitar meticulously or obsessively practicing riffs alone. That side of Ritchie, the one that loved music more than anything, was hidden beneath layers of ego and intensity. Glenn learned quickly that understanding Ritchie required patience, observation, and a willingness to navigate the unpredictable currents of his mood. Joining Deep Purple was not just about playing music, it was about surviving, learning, and growing under the watchful, often stormy eye of Ritchie Blackmore. Glenn recalls how every rehearsal felt like walking on a tightrope. Ritchie Blackmore demanded perfection. If a chord sounded slightly off or a rhythm wasn't precise, Ritchie wouldn't just correct it, he would redo it until it met his exacting standards. Glenn admits this could be exhausting, but it also pushed him to new heights. It was hard work, but the music was extraordinary. He remembers Ritchie stopping mid-song, pointing out tiny details, muttering about tone, timing, or feel. Some musicians might have felt frustrated or defensive, but Glenn learned to adapt. Despite the tough exterior, Ritchie had a method. Glenn noticed that his intensity was reserved for the studio and stage. Once he was in the groove, Ritchie became almost untouchable, lost in the magic of the music. Glenn describes moments during recording sessions when Ritchie's focus created a kind of silence around him. Everyone else had to wait, watch, and absorb. But when the music clicked, when Ritchie was satisfied, the results were otherworldly. It was in those moments that Glenn realized why Ritchie had such a legendary status. He wasn't just a guitarist, he was an architect of sound, demanding the highest level of artistry from everyone around him. Glenn doesn't hide the fact that Ritchie could be temperamental. One day, a small mistake could spark a furious reaction. He recalls times when Ritchie would slam his guitar case, storm out of the room, or yell in frustration. At first, Glenn found it intimidating. He had never experienced someone with such intensity. But over time, he learned to read Ritchie's moods. The anger wasn't personal. It was about the music, about meeting Ritchie's standards. Glenn remembers a particularly tense recording session when a riff wouldn't sit right. Ritchie's frustration filled the studio, his energy almost electrifying. Glenn admits he was nervous, worried he might be fired or humiliated. But then, as suddenly as the storm appeared, it passed. Ritchie would pick up his guitar, play the part flawlessly, and the tension would vanish. Glenn realized that this intensity was part of what made Deep Purple so unique. Ritchie's moods were unpredictable, yes, but they were also a source of brilliance. His storms forced the band to push beyond comfort zones, creating music that was powerful, raw, and unforgettable. Glenn Hughes emphasizes that earning Ritchie's respect was not about charm or friendship, it was about music. Ritchie Blackmore respected talent, dedication, and musicianship above all. Glenn remembers performing live and seeing Ritchie watching him closely, evaluating every note, every rhythm. When Ritchie nodded or smiled, it meant more than praise. It meant he trusted Glenn in the music. It wasn't easy. Glenn recalls nights filled with rehearsals, arguments, and tension. But those moments also brought growth. He learned that Ritchie's high standards forced him to become better, not just as a musician, but as a collaborator. Glenn credits much of his own development to this pressure. He learned discipline, precision, and the art of reading musical intuition. For Glenn, Ritchie was both a challenge and a teacher. The guitarist's intensity was a lesson in commitment, a reminder that greatness required dedication beyond ego or comfort. Glenn Hughes reflects on performing live with Ritchie. On stage, Ritchie was an entirely different force. His energy was electric, commanding attention from the first note. Glenn says that despite their personal differences, the music created an unspoken bond. When Ritchie played, everything else disappeared. Glenn remembers moments during concerts when their improvisation clicked perfectly, riffs and vocals intertwining in ways that thrilled the audience and the band. But chemistry didn't come easy. Glenn had to learn Ritchie's signals, understand his improvisational cues, and anticipate shifts mid-song. It was like dancing with a partner who changed the steps constantly, but when it worked, it was magical. Glenn admits those moments were exhilarating and terrifying. The tension off stage made the connection on stage even stronger. Ritchie's intensity demanded focus, but it also pushed the music to heights that few bands could reach. Studio sessions with Ritchie could be battles of wills. Glenn recalls hours spent arguing over arrangements, tones, and dynamics. Ritchie could be stubborn, refusing to compromise if he felt the music wasn't right. Glenn admits there were times of frustration, feeling like progress was slow, but he also recognizes that these battles produced legendary recordings. Ritchie's attention to detail forced Glenn to rethink his approach. He had to listen harder, play cleaner, and contribute creatively under pressure. Glenn remembers the tension in the studio as a crucible. Everyone was pushed, stretched, and refined. In the end, the results spoke for themselves. Those intense sessions produced songs that became classics, proof that Ritchie's uncompromising standards were not cruelty, but a path to excellence. Outside rehearsals, Glenn saw a quieter, unexpected side of Ritchie. Away from the chaos, he could be introspective, even humorous. Glenn recalls long drives, silent moments, and conversations about music theory, history, and inspiration. It was a side few saw, a reminder that beneath the intensity was a thoughtful, passionate artist. Glenn says these moments helped him understand Ritchie better. The storms, the perfectionism, they were part of a larger personality devoted to music. Seeing this side gave Glenn insight into why Ritchie was the way he was on stage and in the studio. It wasn't ego alone, it was devotion, obsession, and a relentless pursuit of musical excellence. Glenn Hughes admits that clashes with Ritchie were inevitable. They argued, disagreed, and sometimes even shouted at each other. But they also collaborated in ways that created groundbreaking music. Glenn remembers how friction often led to innovation. Ritchie would challenge an idea, push for something more daring, and the end result would be richer than anyone expected. Glenn believes that these clashes weren't destructive, they were creative. They forced him to defend his ideas, refine his playing, and expand his musical range. Working with Ritchie was intense, yes, but also deeply rewarding. He learned that the strongest partnerships often come with the most friction, and in Deep Purple, that friction was the spark behind unforgettable music. Reflecting on his time with Ritchie, Glenn Hughes says the greatest lesson was resilience. He learned to withstand intensity, to focus on music above ego, and to push himself beyond comfort. Ritchie Blackmore demanded perfection, but he also showed what dedication and passion could achieve. Glenn credits much of his growth as a musician to that experience. He also learned patience, observation, and empathy. Understanding Ritchie wasn't easy, but it was rewarding. Glenn emphasizes that the legendary guitarist was not just difficult for the sake of it. He was committed, passionate, and devoted to his art. For anyone who wants to achieve greatness in music, Glenn believes studying Ritchie's intensity, standards, and dedication is essential. Glenn Hughes concludes by remembering Ritchie not just as a demanding genius, but as a musician who shaped his life. Their time together in Deep Purple was intense, challenging, and unforgettable. Glenn doesn't shy away from the difficulties. They were real, vivid, and formative, but he also celebrates the magic, the music, and the lessons learned. He remembers the first time he earned Ritchie's nod of approval, the thrill of a live performance, and the quiet moments of shared understanding. Ritchie Blackmore was complex, tempestuous, and brilliant. For Glenn Hughes, those years were a mixture of fear, admiration, and growth. Above all, they were a testament to what happens when raw talent meets uncompromising dedication. And as Glenn reflects, he knows he will carry those lessons and memories for the rest of his life.